Censorship and propaganda work constantly to infiltrate political spaces and control popular opinion. According to the 2025 annual report by the nonprofit organization Freedom House, global freedom declined for the 19th consecutive year in a row and labeled deepening authoritarianism as the main driving force. The importance of knowledge that comes from becoming further informed about the world outside one's own national politics cannot be stressed enough. I spoke with students, journalists, and academics about their personal experiences and historical accounts on Soviet and contemporary Russian censorship in their respective individual lens. In March of 2025, I sat down with Benjamin Nathan's at NYU before an event for his recently published book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. We spoke about censorship within the Soviet Union, what Soviet dissidence was, and the mark the dissidents have left on the world.
The Soviet Union did have a formal system of state censorship, and every article, essay, book that wanted to get printed formally had to pass through the censorship. And the intensity of censorship fluctuated over time. What's interesting about censorship is that it sort of bleeds into editorial work in a way that sometimes makes it difficult to distinguish between what's being edited and what's being censored for political reasons. In some ways, the first and most powerful one is self-censorship by the author, who declines to say things to help them pass through the censorship system. So the author can self-censor, an editor can censor, and then the censorship board can also decide that something is not going to work. And starting in the 1960s, there was a really interesting sort of DIY mechanism for overcoming censorship, and it was called samizdat, which is just a Russian neologism from the 1950s that means published it myself, in which people would simply type their works on a typewriter, and friends and trusted colleagues would multiply it on their typewriters using carbon paper. And like the way a chain letter works, this could multiply the readership of a text to the point where it had its own distinct public and was completely under the radar of the official censorship system. Samizdat was really the lifeblood of the movement. And if there's one thing that consistently moved in the dissident movement, it wasn't so much people as texts making their way through the networks of samizdat distribution. Samizdat is sort of a spin-off of samizdat. If a samizdat text makes its way out of the Soviet Union by, say, a tourist or a diplomat can take things out without getting inspected at the customs office at the airport, then it could take on a sort of second life in the West. And samizdat refers to those hand-typed manuscripts that found an interested publisher who would either publish them in the original Russian or translate them and create actual published versions with a print run and a binding and everything. Samizdat just means published over there. The cleverer publishers in the West would print these texts in small pocket-sized versions, which made it easier to smuggle in. And so they would make their way back into the Soviet Union as a samizdat text. Trying to define what Soviet dissidence was or who counts as a Soviet dissident, there are multiple definitions. The loosest definition that was popular in the West during the Cold War was anybody who had an open grievance with the Soviet state. I prefer the Soviet usage of dissident, which is people who were seeking to reform the Soviet system by making it obey its own laws, and who were trying to constrain the behavior of the state within the Constitution and the Code of Criminal Procedure and other binding legal documents about state behavior, what the state can and cannot do. In my Soviet definition of dissidence, there was quite a spectrum of political opinion, but most dissidents who were engaged in the act of defending rights that derived from the Soviet Constitution did not think of themselves as political actors. So their political views were, in a sense, kept to the back burner. When we talk about commonalities among the dissidents, we can talk about point of view commonalities. Pretty much without exception, they were all opposed to the use of violence in pursuit of their goal of reforming the Soviet state. They were all pretty much without exception opposed to revolution as a form of political transformation because they were living with the consequences of their own revolutionary tradition. They did not want to repeat the chaos and the violence that had flowed from the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. With all the diversity of personality, these were almost by definition people who were idealistic and stubborn and brave. They all had a kind of high-minded quality that made them believe that it really was worth risking their careers, potentially their lives, for the cause of transforming the Soviet Union into a society based on the rule of law, which to most of their fellow citizens seemed an insane and unrealistic goal. I was interested for a long time in the way people who live in authoritarian societies think about and construe what their political options are. What freedom of movement is there for people who want to be politically engaged in a society that doesn't really tolerate independent political action? In the widest angle sense, I would say there are two lessons. One is a very small number of people can make an extraordinarily outsized difference in history with the right approach and the correct degree of persistence. There really weren't that many dissidents in the Soviet Union. Active core of the movement was probably around 1,000 people. There were tens of thousands of sympathizers, if by that we mean people who read Samizdat, followed the ups and downs of the movement, and there were probably millions of listeners to Western shortwave radio broadcasts, but the real core of the movement was just a drop in the ocean, maybe 1,000 people in a country of roughly 250 million. Just the fact that tiny group of people were able to become so visible and have such an impact on public discourse and on the Cold War and East-West relations.
I spoke with student Matvey Dolan about his personal relationship to Russian censorship. His mom is the famous Russian bard Veronika Dolina, and his brother Anton Dolan is also a well-known Russian film critic.
My older brother is proclaimed as the foreign agent, which is also a new thing in Russian laws. If you at least have 10,000 followers online anywhere, you do count as like a mass media source. And if you're, for example, you're expressing your opinion saying that I think I'm not a big fan of the Russian view on the war and propaganda, it is basically just treason. My brother has a pretty big following online and not only online, and he fled Russia immediately. He and my nephews were all getting death threats and all that stuff just because my brother publicly announced that this is horrible and he's not supporting the war. The evening when my brother was just packing his stuff up with his family, leaving Russia, me and my mom came to their apartment to say goodbyes. At that point, all of the lights in his apartment complex were cut off, and he had a huge Z symbol spray painted on his door of his apartment. So he was proclaimed foreign agent, which is a status where you have to start your post with a huge thing mentioning that this information is shared by the foreign agent named like that. And then you only start your post like saying, I had a great breakfast today. Or you will be fined starting from $2,500 and it goes up and it can change from an administrative fee and fine to a criminal offense. If you do this 3 times, you can just post a picture of your omelet without mentioning that you are an enemy of the state, basically. And also my brother works for Medusa, which is a company, is proclaimed the unwanted organization. And basically they're terrorists in Russian. Right. So there is a case on him not following these rules in Russia. And as I know right now, nothing else goes on specifically against my brother, but against a lot of people it does. And a lot of not even people with a huge online following or whatever got into a lot of trouble for just posting stuff which is not Russian propaganda about Russian-Ukrainian war, but from any English language source or Russian language media from outside of Russia, which is not sponsored by the government, who are not sharing Russian news on the Russian-Ukrainian wars.
Today, those who express dissent are often legally reprimanded as foreign agents. According to the Human Rights Watch organization, as of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, authorities no longer need to prove any foreign funding, as the legislation was drastically extended to include any individual or organization deemed to be under vaguely defined foreign influence. Amendments also exclude alleged foreign agents from many aspects of public life, such as the civil service, elected office, teaching children, etc. Penalties range from hefty fines to up to 5 years in prison. I then had the chance to speak with a college student in New York City from Russia about her experience living there, consuming media, family, and how it all informs her own future.
I'm from Yekaterinburg. I would say that Yekaterinburg is like one of the most liberal cities, and government does not like it, but I'm proud of it. After war started, there were big protests. During Navalny's time, people went to big protests as well. Even though it was winter and it was cold, people did not care about it. They would go and express their opinion. But now, I still hear sometimes, like here and there, people expressing their opinions, which is different from the government's. But I feel like it's less and less. And maybe people trying to find another way of expressing their opinion, which could be through art, through poetry, through street art. For Yekaterinburg, street art really matters. There's just a lot of festivals where people gather together, and it's like over the summers they do all this like graffiti stuff or like the whole exhibitions, which used to be really politically motivated. And I see the decline in street art as well, which is sad. I've always hated TV because first of all, it's not interesting because it's not diverse. And my family did not watch TV, which I'm really glad because it's such a powerful tool of propaganda nowadays. And I was just always reading independent newspapers on Instagram and just read posts there. Generally speaking, I'd say that people older than me are more conscious of what they consume, and they consume independent journalism, and they don't watch TV. But people younger than me, they just don't care. They don't watch TV, but they don't also read the independent journalism, which when you kind of don't have this last thread of like consciousness in face of like independent journalism, then you're, in my opinion, subject of propaganda because it's just something that surrounds you. And when you lose this thread of independence and at least some ideas, you lose your brain. You're getting brainwashed, unfortunately. And it's just sad to see that some of it happens with people I know. And these are not the older people. I used to at least think that older people get brainwashed easily, but it's sad to see that younger people do as well. When I was growing up as a kid, I didn't think there were anything like this, like labels or something that would mark that this is book that you have to think twice before buying and read. But all the thing with marking books as like book by a foreign agent or something like this, it came literally after the beginning of war. They have like books and then you open them and you see just blacked out lines. And these are lines like about LGBTQ. They just black it out and sell it like this. And this is actually like the main change. What is crazy to me is that they can just cross out what they don't like and sell it like this. Like, why would you do this with literature? This is so crazy. Another thing about censorship is that when I was living in Russia, I used to get my news from like Instagram or YouTube, which are not Russian platforms, obviously. And now there are banned in Russia, like Meta is banned, and YouTube has been slower down, so people have to use VPNs. But the point of this whole thing is that these are foreign platforms where liberal ideas can get into from the US or from whatever, and where independent journalism can take place. You can just shut it down. My grandma always liked Putin, and my granddad did as well. It's just unchangeable. And I remember talking to them about it, but I was also young, and I could argue with them without having really great arguments just because I was so mad. And for me, it was obvious that it's not great, but what's obvious for you is not obvious for them. And they just always had this strong opinion. If this is the leader, you should respect him in any of his actions, and this is how you show that you love your country, which is not, but they just don't understand it. It's how they were taught, so it's hard to change. Since we moved to the US, I think it was last year, a woman came from the US to Ekaterinburg to visit her family, and she has dual citizenship. She's a citizen of the US and Russia. With all my experience, I know that when the US citizen comes to Russia, they search everything. She came to Russia. They searched her because she is a citizen of the US, and they found out that she sent like $50 to Ukrainian foundation to support Ukraine. They put her in jail for 12 years. I told my mom about it, and it was crazy because it was in Ekaterinburg where we used to live. And I would imagine this happening in Moscow or St. Petersburg, in major airports, but it was Ekaterinburg, and I was like, wow, this is where I live. This is crazy. And my mom got really scared, and she didn't want us to go to Russia anytime. We talk about it always amongst immigrants. There's this idea of like, you stop being an immigrant as soon as you stop thinking about coming back. But I don't stop thinking about coming back. Definitely not right now. Russia will get through this. I don't know in what way. Do we have to wait until Putin dies, or we can actually do something about it earlier, or how we gonna clean up the whole system? I don't know. It's not something I can solve, but I believe that it's going to happen in my lifetime. And being a journalist, Russia will really need a lot of great journalists with understanding of how journalism, proper, independent, fair, should work. It's really important for me to help my country. Probably what scared me is the propagandistic stuff, because it's not by any chance under journalistic principles. It's not how it should be. I see people affected by this. I just see where it got us as a country, and I think media has a big role, and just like media should have some judgment for what government does, and I don't want this to keep happening.
I interviewed student and former Doxa journalist Misha Levit about his relationship to Doxa and his thoughts on journalism.
I learned about Doxa in my university. First, it was just a tiny project, an organization within the university paper. And Doxa organized a lot of protests, riots, everything. And it was the only source of information of how things could be different. They started their own editorial space. They were able to write, to publish stuff about a lot of leftist topics. Mostly it was university and education orientated, but they started writing about working rights, LGBT rights. For working with the undeserved organization, you can get up to 6 years of prison. We were claimed like terrorists. Because once the draft started, one of our editors wrote a piece about we need to burn the draft centers, make Molotov and just burn it. This was crazy, but still. I started working with them in 2022. I applied as a video editor. Soon, I kind of developed the whole tone of voice of our YouTube channel. It is very unique within the Russian media YouTube. It is a lot of video essay, but in form of explainers. We are pretty much aware of our bias. There is no unbiased journalism. And at least in this, we're very truthful. Is world trying to make it possible for independent information to get into Russian, to still have some connection to our Russian audience. Any authoritarian regime is trying to control everything. And for the outlets in exile, it is a very existential matter. Because if you can't work with your audience, the audience can treat you. There's no reason for you to be out there. Even those which we can call independent. There's no such thing, you can be out of political environment. you are embodied into this language of authoritarian regime where you can't really name things as they should be named. When you are talking about culture, there is no politics involved, but culture is politics. The reason why a lot of independent media outlets immigrated as well is because there is no way you can consider yourself journalists when there is censorship involved.
To gain further insight into the nuances of Soviet and Russian censorship, alongside commentary on the US and Russia and their differences, I spoke with Professor Basil Lvov.
On one hand, the government is not as much in control of the life of the society as it used to be in the Soviet Union, which was a totalitarian state. On the other hand, as Yevtushenko wrote, a poet in Russia is more than a poet. Russia is a logocentric civilization. The Soviet Union was also logocentric. It was afraid of what people could write or what they could say, but this also upheld faith in the word. You could say that that society was poetics-based in many ways. That's part of the tradition of the Russian intelligentsia and the role of literature there, which has to do with censorship as well. The Zopian speech. In present-day Russia, censorship, in my view, is moving in the direction of totalitarianism, but at the same time, it's definitely not there. I would just think of it as a spectrum. In authoritarian states, you have the kind of censorship which punishes you for publicizing something. But at the same time, physically, you have at least some opportunities to publicize your work. In Russia, it's very easy nowadays to publish whatever you want as a private person. You can write anything on vk.com, which is the Russian version of Facebook. So I would say that an important technique of intimidating people now that's part of censorship is that the Russian government isn't hiding things anymore. The totalitarian state of the socialist Soviet Union was very much different in this regard from the authoritarian and fascist state of Russia now. So look at the Soviet Union comparing the Russian government today for contrast, not for parallels, unless you want to talk about the KGB and people like Putin, who are the children of that structure. Because the party elite indeed had to step down, but the KGB stepped up, because they had no more competition from the party as they did before during the Soviet time. Technology has made it easier nowadays for people to have a say, but not necessarily hear, so to speak. The situation with freedom of speech is getting worse and worse in Russia. I would say that given the technological environment you have in Russia today, the best way of combating freedom of speech and expression among the people is intimidation. As Bretz-Aguirre put it, my differences with the Soviet government were of a stylistic nature. Style matters a lot, and the more repressive the government becomes, the more style matters, which is why it started to matter more now with Putin 2 or 3.0 compared to the earlier Putin. I'm talking about Russian authoritarianism after the invasion of Ukraine. And now, if you look at what the Russian government does, or rather the so-called journalists working for the Russian government, the problem is that whereas Soviet censorship was meticulous, to the point of being paranoid, you are not only sloppy in today's Russia, you are deliberately sloppy, because the idea is to pollute the info space so that you'd have multiple versions of quote-unquote reality. That's what we call post-truth. Russia and America have a lot of things in common. But most of those overlaps result in two different paths taken by those two different nations. I think it's important to go to the very outset, consider the whole history. These are different societies. To be a citizen in Russia and to be a citizen in the United States aren't the same thing. The way people see the government, the fact that in Russia you see государство, which means the state. You seldom see government. Правительство, say государство, which people linguistically, mentally identify with the country. Russia is an extremely centralized, over-centralized country. I would say that if you take the American president and his administration now, you'll find a lot in common with the Russian president and his entourage. It's extremely important to consider also that in Russia, a great number of people also look up to the state, even though they may dislike it, because that's where they get their money from. What do authoritarian regimes do? They intimidate. When you subject yourself to self-censorship, it's much harder to categorize it as a form of censorship and to have a case based on it. If we spoke about the consequences of these authoritarian trends going against the freedom of speech, if we spoke about the consequences of those trends for the journalists, the people, if we spoke about the mechanisms of resistance, peaceful resistance, mind you, that's a very different conversation. In America, the resources for peaceful protest, in my opinion, they are enormous. Not in Russia. The cost of protesting in Russia is extremely high. And that is to be considered when we talk about censorship. In America, this price is much lower, which is not to say that it's still not considerable, and which is not to say that we shouldn't be absolutely alarmed by the very fact we're talking about it in this context right now.
Concluding the interviews, I'm going to return to Benjamin Nathans on what can be taken away from the Soviet dissident movement.
I think is a really important lesson for anybody who's looking around and wondering whether a small movement that they're involved in could possibly produce the kind of change that they strive to achieve. The other lesson is that the rule of law and the defense of the rule of law, I think, really is an essential part of resistance in virtually every setting of authoritarianism or whatever degree of suppression of democratic values is happening. But it's not sufficient. The rule of law alone is rarely enough of a platform to galvanize a significant part of the population. And it doesn't really answer questions about what kind of reformed state we're going to have. So I see it as a minimalist position, but there has to be more than that. There has to be some version of a political consensus about the kind of state and the kind of society that people want beyond simply being law-abiding. Those are the really general lessons that I would extract from the story. A more specific one targeted at Russia today would be that people who protest should not feel that they have to invent everything from scratch. There is this lineage, even though arguably the Soviet dissident movement did not achieve a good number of its central goals, it achieved things that it wasn't aiming for. This is one of the ironies of history, is the unintended outcomes that are so often influential. It did achieve the unintended outcome of draining the Soviet system of a good deal of its legitimacy, because they exposed it over and over again as a system that couldn't manage to obey its own laws, or was refusing to obey its own laws. It's hard to look like a modern state when you're violating your own constitution all the time. The media landscape has changed quite dramatically. The ruthlessness of Putin's government now, especially during wartime, is quite a bit greater than that of the late Soviet era. It's nowhere near what we saw under Stalinism, but it's more lethal and it's more reckless than the final several decades of Soviet history, which is when the dissident movement was thriving. So I don't want to imply that we can just map dissident techniques one-on-one to the current situation, but I do think it is a usable past. And there are values that were inscribed in the movement's practices that I think are very valuable and a source of inspiration today. One of the things that I think the Putin government really learned from the Soviet experience is that you can use emigration as a safety valve to get rid of troublesome and inconvenient citizens. And in the months following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, February 2022, almost 1 million Russians left the country, 900,000 some. Many of those people, not all, but many of those people would have been the ones going out on the streets to protest. They would have been the ones who created the rank and file of any kind of dissident movement. It was a very astute move on the part of the government to essentially let those people out and therefore free themselves of the trouble and the bad PR of dealing with them. There were costs to that policy. They lost a lot of very talented people, a lot of people that are important for the Russian economy. But overall, I think the net effect of that wave of emigration after February 22 was that those who remained inside Russia felt much more isolated than they would have if nobody had been allowed to leave. Nonetheless, you do find individual acts of dissent, some of them symbolic, people leaving up anonymous messages, people leaving little dolls and sculptures that are connected to the war in Ukraine. It's a very challenging environment, to put it mildly. The Kremlin has really cracked down on even what we would regard as innocuous expressions. And the famous example is of people first holding up signs that said, "No to war," "Нет войне," so 3 letters and then 5 letters. And then when they got arrested, other people came with signs that just had 3 asterisks and 5 asterisks, and everybody knew what that meant. I should say "No to war" was considered inflammatory because Putin insisted that it wasn't a war, it was a special military operation. The censorship regime now in Russia is quite severe. And then people would show up just with a blank piece of paper that said nothing, but everyone understood what it was supposed to say. They got arrested, and then people would just show up with their hands like this, miming holding a piece of paper, and that became a punishable offense as well. So the crackdown is severe, far harsher than what it was in, say, the Brezhnev era. Putin also goes after people who are living outside the country, whom he considers to be traitors, and he gets to decide who qualifies as a traitor. You know about the assassinations and the poisonings, etc. So it's a very challenging environment. I've always been struck that the Soviet Union, being a highly secretive state, was structurally designed to be bad at public relations. It was very good at secrecy and at covert operations and espionage when it came to public relations. It was clumsy. The current Russian government is much less clumsy. It's much more alive to the nuances of public relations, not just as a general matter, but in the age of the internet and social media. I think what Putin has learned is to focus, first of all, on what you might call the commanding heights of the media landscape, and that means television above all. He worries less about print media, doesn't worry too much about what academics publish in their books and what academic journals say, because he knows that not many people are going to read those things. And also he knows that some degree of Western ideas and thinking is going to seep because it no longer has anything remotely like hermetically sealed borders. Up until surprisingly recently, the internet was a very free space in Russia. You could really find almost anything you might want to look for in the Russian internet. And again, as in so many other arenas, the war changed that dramatically. Now the Russian internet looks much more like the Chinese internet than the American internet. They're trying to create a kind of protective wall around their own media space, and they're going after people who say things on the internet that they don't like. So you can really get in trouble for posting things, whether it's on your blog or something else. And I think the Putin government learned how to be savvy internet censors through its interaction with people like Alexei Navalny, the dissident who was killed in a Russian prison in February of 2024. Navalny was a very quick learner about social media for organizing protests, getting the word out, showing how the government was corrupt and violating various laws. And it was like a choreography where he would be a couple steps ahead, and then the Russian security services would catch on to him. And by now, the internet really is no longer a totally free space in Russia. There are still pockets of dissent, but they're shrinking. And the media outposts that used to be responsible for alternative opinions in Russia have all been driven out of the country. There are still dissidents who are alive, and some of them are still active. Some of them, believe it or not, still live in Russia. I can speculate about what the ones that I studied would do, but we actually know what former Soviet dissidents are saying. And what they're saying is that people need to use the internet as much as possible, even within the limited space that it offers, that people need to find their way to each other so as not to feel alone and isolated. People have to understand that the consequences of the war for ordinary Russian citizens are really the most important thing to focus on. Yes, the government is still corrupt. The war is inflicting all kinds of brutality on Ukraine and Ukrainians, but the weak link in the chain right now on the Russian side are the costs of the war for Russia itself. terms of lives lost, people coming back mutilated from fighting at the front, and this slowly rising inflation that, of course, hits everybody. The Soviet dissident movement really did not do a great job connecting with the Soviet population at large. It was focused like a laser on civil liberties issues. And I think today the message is your agenda has to go way beyond civil liberties to quality of life and broader issues that will touch ordinary citizens, regardless of their politics.
Thanks to all of these different perspectives, I wanted to create a small but valuable archive of Soviet and contemporary Russian censorship. Knowledge is power. Information is power. I'm ending this film with an excerpt of the book, The New Censorship Inside the Global Battle for Media Freedom by Joel Simon. In today's globalized, interconnected world, free and unfettered information is more essential than ever. It's essential for markets and for trade, and it's essential to empowering the emerging community of global citizens and ensuring that they are able to participate in a meaningful way in the decisions that affect their lives. Likewise, those who are deprived of information are essentially disempowered. We live in a world in which the abundance of information obscures the enormous gaps in our knowledge created by violence, repression, and state censorship. Ensuring that news and information circulate freely throughout societies and across borders is the challenge of our time.